Quick question. If someone claiming to be a time traveler gave you a detailed prediction of your future and backed it up with accurate but not impossible to know information about your life, would you believe them? Let me know your answer in the comments below. Anyway, on to the video. Our story begins in the heart of a bustling metropolis. The streets are clean, the people are calm, and even the chaotic traffic you might expect from such a city is non-existent. Almost as if you were looking at a perfect utopia. But is it? Is it really? Contrary to the serene and beautiful facade, the true undercurrents hidden in the shadows are nothing short of horrific and tragic. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's wind back time to our MC's somewhat blissful and definitely naive days at his dead-end job. As we do, he hits us with an inner monologue, secretly setting the tone for his desperate journey to come. He says that humans have always evolved by exterminating other species. It is through their fall that we rise. But what if those species decide to fight back? What if we aren't the top species anymore? What then? In an immaculately decorated office, a man casually smacks a mosquito on his neck before tossing the little fucker into an ashtray. Before him is a meek Chad with a silent, almost imperceptible fury and defiance hidden in his eyes. This Chad, who should honestly fire his barber, is our MC, Mr. Lee. Opposite him is his boss, Mr. Choi. As expected from such dead-end, soul-sucking jobs, Lee is currently being chewed out by Mr. Choi. The subject of the rebukes is mostly predictable. Choi calling Lee a lazy bum while elevating himself to a savior by claiming he helped save Lee's job and those of others in the department. To this, Lee could only bow his head and apologize, promising to do his best next time. Obviously, Choi wouldn't let him off that easily. He insulted him some more before ceremoniously kicking him out of the office. As Lee left, some of his coworkers shot sympathetic glances his way. They seemed to want to say something, but under the pressure of possibly losing their own jobs, they decided against it in the end. Later on, in the washroom, the same coworkers are seen cleaning up. Unlike last time, they finally had enough courage to give us some office lore. The blue-shirted coward called Choi a nutjob. A nepo baby who only got his position through connections. He also added that Choi is a thief and that the famed patent for the satellite navigation system he claimed to invent was actually stolen from Lee. Choi had taken advantage of him back when he was still a naive rookie. The bespectacled coward asked why Choi was harassing Lee if that was the case. Shouldn't he be keeping him close instead? The blue coward replied that Choi didn't want Lee around for fear of being found out. He'd been harassing Lee so the Chad would resign on his own, eliminating any loose ends that might come back to bite him. The bespectacled bastard was taken aback by this. Who knew Mr. Choi was so devious? But if that was true, why was Lee still sticking around? Shouldn't he take the hint and leave? Blue Bastard explained that it wasn't that easy. During a previous government project, the asshole Choi had used Lee's name to get funding. He then misused the funds, landing Lee in a whole shit show of legal trouble. It was a miracle Lee wasn't arrested, but the stain remained on his record. So the Chad was stuck. He couldn't get any company to hire him. Not with that kind of mark on his reputation. Blue Bastard added that the rumors circulating in the office hinted at the whole thing being a setup, a deliberate move by Choi to ruin Lee. The bespectacled coward marveled at the drama. Since when did this place become an episode of Keeping Up with the K's? At least in that show he could see some synthetic cheeks. But what about the office? Should he look forward to seeing Choi's ugly face? Nah. Fuck that. Indeed, it's true what they say. When the army's not at war, it's not the best commanders who earn their stars, but the political ones. It's the same in their company. It's not the most competent ones who get promoted, but the political ones. However, all that has nothing to do with them. So long as they kiss some ass, specifically Choi's ass, they should be fine. Blue Bastard laughed at the idea, but he didn't disagree. Indeed, the best way out was to pucker those lips and plant a wet one on Choi's ass. Pause. Only then would they be safe. Over at the employees' outdoor rest area, we see Lee fidgeting with something in his pocket. After a bit of struggle, it's revealed that the item is an empty cigarette box, which he promptly crushes in rage. Out of cigarettes, he briefly contemplates borrowing some from his co-workers, but immediately dismisses it, choosing to wallow in his misery instead. In his hand is a picture of his family, probably the only thing keeping him going in that awful place. Just as he's lamenting his unfortunate existence, A gentle voice calls out to him, offering a cigarette with a beaming smile. Lee accepts the cigarette, a dazed look in his eyes. He then warns the baddie to stay away. Being seen with him isn't exactly a good thing in the company. The baddie scoffs at the remark. Why? Because of Choi? As far as she's concerned, the ugly bastard can suck it. She isn't worried about him in the slightest. Instead, she's worried about him. What's with that sullen face? Didn't he know there were lots of people who respected and revered him? It's just that they're afraid of Choi, so they can't speak up. But aside from that, did he know why Choi was acting more like an asshole than usual these days? Something had to be going on, right? Lee takes a drag from his cigarette before responding to the baddie. And yes, I said baddie. You youngins might not know this, but such art used to be Picasso masterpieces for jerk rituals back in the day. Don't let the design fool you. Those pixel, box-shaped cheeks have caused sleepless nights for many chads in the old days. Anyway, Lee throws shade at Choi, revealing that the Nepo baby is at his wit's end. He's reached the limit of what he can achieve with connections and opportunism, and now he has nothing else to show. In such a situation, it's obvious he'd get desperate and scramble for achievements, even though he knows it's futile. The pixel baddie smiles at Choi's misfortune before shifting her attention to Lee. What about him? Did he have any plans? Or was he planning to stay like that forever? Lee silently drags on his cigarette, a lost look in his eyes. After a while, he finally responds to the question, but the answer isn't all that optimistic. He says he doesn't know. Whatever happens, happens, he guesses. Just as the baddie is about to confront him for his bitchy behavior, a siren suddenly rings, drawing their attention. Following the siren is a PA announcement warning staff that a swarm of wasps is approaching, and they should hurry back into the building. Obviously, Lee is taken aback. Just how bad is the swarm for the announcer to panic like that? Or did the Chad take a quick trip to Colombia to purchase that good? In any case, something isn't right, and he might as well check it out for himself. He casts his gaze at the buzzing noise up ahead, and what he sees makes him tremble. Above, to the sides, and even before him is a swarm of giant wasps, creatures straight out of a horror film. Lee stares at the giant monstrosities in shock. Just what in the hot hell is this? Is this real? Or did his cigarette get laced with that Senior Escobar secret sauce? Surely this has to be a dream, right? As he's still doubting his sanity, a wasp grabs him and stings him in the gut. The pain finally jolts him to his senses, but by then, it's already too late. Lee felt his vision blur before everything turned black. After an unknown period of time in an unknown place, his motionless hand suddenly twitched before the Chad came back to his senses. On his emaciated jaw were a few stubbles, hinting that quite some time had passed since he passed out. With great difficulty, Lee shook off the dizziness as he slowly rose from the ground. However, halfway through the rise, he noticed something strange and shifted his gaze to his abdomen. What he saw made his scalp tingle. Embedded in his stomach was a batch of wasp eggs, obviously using him as a nest, or maybe host. Predictably, Lee freaked the hell out. He shouted at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what was happening to him. But of course, no one replied, and that was just the beginning of his nightmare. All around him were dozens of corpses, or maybe paralyzed humans, all of them unwillingly reduced to hosts for the wasps. They lay motionless on the ground, helpless as the larvae sucked them dry. Pause. Before Lee could adjust to the harrowing sight, a faint crack came from the eggs in his stomach, forcing him to turn to them. Out of the eggs came sickening larvae, ones too huge and ugly to look at. The damned bastards quickly shook off their drowsiness and charged straight for Lee, who at this point was scared shitless. He scrambled back in horror, but that didn't stop the larvae from chasing him down and chomping on him. As he felt his vitality being drained by the little monsters, Lee finally said fuck that and ripped the little creatures from his body. He proceeded to stomp them like crazy, making sure their putrid green blood soaked the floor. Done with that, Lee turned to the rest of the hosts, hoping at least one of them was still alive. He bellowed at them to wake up, otherwise, they would all die there. When he didn't get a response, he chose the closest host, opting to free all of them himself. However, halfway through the task, he suddenly noticed a giant hole in the wall, which compelled his curious, nosy ass to investigate. As expected, and just like every other time before, what he saw made him pause. His city, The once bustling metropolis comparable to a utopia was no more. In its place was a sickening ruin. For as far as he could see, the buildings had turned into horrific nests, all of them breeding the next brood of wasps for sure. Lee took in this sight, and his knees couldn't help but buckle. He dropped to his knees, fear and despair etched on his face. Just what the hell was this? And where was his family? His wife? His daughter? This couldn't be happening to him, right? Just as his world was crumbling down, a silent click came from behind him, scaring the shit out of him. Lee immediately turned to check, wondering what the hell it was now. Surely things couldn't get much worse than this, right? As if answering with a maybe, a hand suddenly opened the door, its creaking hinges reverberating in the quiet room. As for whether it was a friend or foe, that was yet to be seen. Lee watched with bated breath as the creaking door opened wider. Behind it, in the nestled darkness, a bizarre silhouette slowly emerged, accompanied by a chitinous, saw-like screech. When the door fully opened, a vile monstrosity was revealed, making his already tense skin crawl. The human, or more like host at this point, was beyond pale, with numerous clusters of wasp eggs nesting on his back. Lee saw the withering creature and couldn't help but exclaim in shock. With how many eggs were feasting on his flesh, it was a miracle the poor fellow hadn't been reduced to a sack of flesh and bones already. He contemplated what to do before his stupid, nosy instincts compelled him to help the man. He quickly walked up to him, trying his best to pry away the wasp larvae nested on his back. The man, in turn, looked at him almost as if bewildered by his foolish actions. I mean, was this dude for real? Or had the apocalypse made his survival instincts dull? In any case, shit inevitably hit the fan, and the host began barfing up a slug of green goo. Just when I thought Lee would finally get the hint and get the hell out of there, this stupid motherfucker ignored all the ominous signs and got even closer. He addressed the host, promising to save him from that fate. As he said this, the host continued to blow chunks, and the foolish Lee ignored it, almost as if he was doing it deliberately. At some point, the host shot him a look, seemingly saying, "Really, dude? You don't see this shit?" But of course, Lee ignored that as well, choosing to stare at him instead. Finally, after who knows how long, Lee's brain started working again, and he finally realized how strange the situation was. He saw the man for what he truly was. Not a human, but a vile host, one way beyond saving. Unfortunately, by then, it was already too late. Turns out the barfing wasn't just for show, but served as a signal to summon something over, and that something now had its eyes locked on Lee. Lee crumpled to the ground in fear, an audible whimper escaping his lips. He stared at the insect in shock, wondering how it got that big. When he realized his doom was approaching, he quickly tried to escape, but that notion was immediately shattered by a pincer attack from the wasps. Desperate and trapped on both sides by enemies, Lee didn't hesitate to throw himself into the pile of corpses. So what if he became a host again? All he needed was to survive. Luckily, the wasps weren't after him specifically, but after the green goo barfed up by the host. They all gathered towards it, ignoring Lee, who was hidden amongst the corpses. After receiving the alert from the host, the wasps slowly spread out, seemingly searching for Lee. They combed through the whole room, inching closer and closer to him. Just as his capture seemed inevitable, a faint voice called out, drawing the wasps' attention. The voice belonged to a poor lady who, like Lee, had just woken up from her coma. Before the lady could process what the hell was going on, the wasps were already upon her, towering before her like giant predators. They easily subdued the horrified prey, sinking their stingers deep into her gut. After seconds of intense sucking, the lady was quickly drained, left with nothing but a hollow body of skin and bones. Lee saw this, and couldn't help but thank his lucky stars. If he hadn't hidden fast enough, that would have been his end too. Luckily, he'd survived, though he wasn't sure how long that would last. With their main target killed, the wasps retreated, disappearing to who knows where. Lee took this chance to quickly crawl from his hiding place. As much as he was grateful to the corpse for shielding him, he couldn't keep hiding in their midst. That was both crazy and insanely dangerous. He tore himself free from the piled corpses, crawling away toward a hopeful escape. As he fled, Lee thought back to the strange occurrence from back then. Why was it that the wasps attacked the lady but ignored the man? Was it that the man was a full host? A corpse even? If so, Then how was he still able to stand? And what was that strange green goo he vomited out? There were so many unanswered questions that Lee felt his brain heat up. However, despite all that, there was still one thing more pressing, and that was to get the hell out of there. He stealthily crawled along the wall, trying his best to remain as inconspicuous as possible. When he finally made it to a corner, and just when his hopes were high, everything came crumbling down as the escape hallway was crowded with tons of hosts. Lee didn't know if the hosts had the same properties as the last one, but there was no way in hell he would take that risk. Since both ways were blocked, he opted to circle back, hoping his luck would be better at the next exit. The emergency ladder. After unimaginable horror, tension, and close shaves, Lee finally made it to the emergency exit and couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. Although there was a host by the door, the vile creature seemed to be dormant, so Lee deemed it wise not to bother with it at all. Turning his focus to the door, he realized his escape wasn't going to be as easy as he'd thought. The door was battered and broken, not to mention the massive rubble blocking it off. Lee cursed his shitty luck, but ultimately decided to do what needed to be done. It wasn't like he had any other options anyway. After monstrous effort, he finally cleared out the rubble, giving himself access to the door. Although the door was blocked just as he'd expected, he'd come so far that giving up wasn't an option anymore. He locked all the fuck in before banging on the door like a crazed psycho. Thanks to his relentless efforts, the door finally budged, allowing access to the emergency exit. Lee's smile bloomed like a flower, a small seedling of hope planted in his heart. Sure, it wasn't going to be easy, but with a little more effort, he should be able to escape that cursed building. On top of that, scaling down the building was way easier than going up, so he should be able to pull it off somehow. Just as his smile reached full bloom and his hopes were at their peak, a scene unfolded before Lee, sinking his heart to the depths of the abyss. The emergency exit, the same exit he'd pinned his hopes on, was completely destroyed, barring any attempt to flee the building. Lee took in the sight and cursed the universe profusely. His once hopeful face instantly darkened, reduced to a hollow mask of its former self. He stared blankly, puzzled by what he should do next. Should he double back and look for a new exit? But to what end? And who's to say the next exit wouldn't be just as disappointing, or maybe even worse? Just as he was lost in thought, the floor suddenly trembled, scaring the shit out of him. Lee hurried to secure his footing, his survival instincts proving right for once. After the commotion ended, he realized the tremble was from the collapsing staircase, further adding to his despair. Even if he secured a rope, the effort would be pointless, as most of the staircase was gone. He couldn't even lower himself to a lower floor. Damn. Just what kind of shitty luck was that? Troubled and frustrated, Lee held onto the door, stumped by what he should do now. Unbeknownst to him, his awful day was just beginning, as vile creatures were stalking from the background. Turns out the eggs on the host had hatched, and the little bastards were hungry for some food. And since Lee was the only edible thing around, they immediately charged at him, biting hard into his flesh. Lee felt the pain, and the self-pity immediately disappeared. What was the point of wallowing in despair when he was literally being eaten alive? He locked in, punching and crushing the little shits from his body. Unfortunately for the fool, he didn't pay much attention to his surroundings, and inevitably slipped off the floor. The feeling of weightlessness jolted him to his senses, and Lee scrambled to save his life. However, that relief was quickly doused as the remaining larvae charged at him, eager to capitalize on his misfortune. Lee noticed the lunging bastards and said, "Fuck that." Even if it was a post-apocalyptic world, wasn't this difficulty a bit too outrageous? Shouldn't he be going through a somewhat tutorial first before doing this shit? Well, to hell with it. He might as well go hard. He immediately retaliated, punching the larvae to literal chunks. After the first came the second, then the third, and Lee didn't stop for even a second as he desperately fought for his survival. The larvae also did the same, crawling across his body and biting his flesh. The two parties struggled intensely, ultimately drawing the attention of a wandering host. As expected, the bastard didn't let it slide, but instead charged at Lee, obviously planning to join the tango. Lee noticed this, and immediately despaired. Not only was he locked in a fight with the little vermin, he was still hanging on the edge, a horrible position to be in. If he didn't find a way out of this, then falling to his death would be the most merciful of his endings. With that idea in mind, he reached out for the rubble below him, hoping to use it as a foothold to escape his dire predicament. However, as he'd come to learn so far, when it rains, it really fucking pours. He lost his grip on the floor, causing him to fall off. Lee's heart instantly dropped. He instinctively flailed his hands, hoping to catch something, anything, to save his life. Luckily, he did just that and managed to grab hold of a metal rod, barely surviving that hell. With a questionable foothold gained, Lee set off to escape that situation. He turned his gaze towards the lower floors, hoping to make a giant leap towards them. However, as typical of his hell difficulty apocalypse, things wouldn't be that simple. Just as he was about to make his move, a giant wasp crept up on him, almost as if it was Diddy or something. Lee noticed the beast, and his scalp couldn't help but tingle. Was this Mr. Take That? And was he about to take that? Pause. Seriously though, he cried to the author to reduce the difficulty, because this was some bullshit. Locking back in, Lee did a double take on the wasp. Although he'd cried about the absurd difficulty of the apocalypse, he knew he couldn't rely on anyone but himself to survive. Besides, the wasp was already upon him. So what would crying to the author accomplish? He promptly dialed in, looking for any chance to escape. However, how could escape be that easy? Especially with a giant fucking wasp behind him. He currently had no opening, so he settled for staying as inconspicuous as possible. As Lee was deluding himself with his half-baked stealth techniques, the wasp closed in on him, seemingly confused by something. It probed Lee gently, feeling him out with its antennae. Lee, who was already shitting bricks at this point, trembled seriously, a visible panic evident on his face. He tried his best to ignore the probing antennae, but the creepy sensation still sent shivers down his spine. No matter what he did, he couldn't shake off the feeling of having a predator so close to him, its hot, foul breath blowing down his neck. Seemingly coming to terms with his inevitable demise, Lee's will faded, causing his grip to involuntarily loosen. He believed it was far better to fall to his death than to be eaten alive by a pest. However, halfway through his suicidal attempt, vivid memories flashed, causing his movements to stop. He suddenly remembered his wife and daughter, and what it would be like for them if he left them alone in this ruined world. Wouldn't that mean they'd be trapped in a hellish place, with their only source of security too chicken to rescue them? Nah, he couldn't let that happen. He'd rather become wasp food than abandon them. He quickly steeled himself, vowing not to die until he found them. As for the wasp, it continued its probing, obvious confusion evident in its actions. It zeroed in on the larva, seemingly attempting to communicate with it. However, after seconds of failed attempts, the wasp finally lost it, screeching loudly to express its frustration. Lee, who'd been trying his best to remain stealthy, cursed at this point, wondering why his luck was so shitty. He quickly looked for a way out, finding one on some rubble close by. However, with his horrible condition, would it even be possible to make such a jump? He thought about it, but then a realization dawned on him. What other choice did he have? He couldn't stay there, so he might as well risk it. Just as he was about to roll the dice, the wasp suddenly flew off, leaving Lee completely confused. Why had it left like that? Didn't it want to eat him a second ago? Well, who was he to question blessings? It didn't matter why it left. All he knew now was his chance. If he couldn't use the opening to escape, then he might very well die there. Acting on this, Lee scaled across the collapsed wall. He inched his way toward the destination, suffering zero setbacks during the endeavor. However, good things never last long. When he finally reached the last stretch before the jump, Lee realized things wouldn't be as easy as they'd been so far, if they'd even been easy to begin with. The distance to the platform was huge, causing him to hesitate. But then again, what choice did he have? He literally couldn't turn back, so his only choice was to keep moving forward. Thus, Lee grit his teeth and threw himself toward the platform. Amidst screams and curses of regret, Lee shot toward the rubble, his silhouette slowly closing in on it. Unfortunately, his gamble didn't work out, and he missed it by a dozen inches. Horrified and with no backup, Lee screamed in shock, his eyes showing an intense despair. He already knew the chances were slim, but damn it, couldn't he have been the one to beat the odds? Why was his luck always so shitty? Just as he was lamenting his awful fate, he suddenly bumped into a metal beam, causing his body to flip uncontrollably. Because of that, He was miraculously flung toward nearby rubble, temporarily saving his life. However, the difficult moments weren't done just yet. Lee helplessly slid off the rubble, forcing him to hold on for dear life. The struggle was so strained that all his fingernails got torn off during the process. Luckily, he fought through the pain and barely held his ground. If he hadn't, then he might have been a bloody paste on the ground already. Locking back in, Lee increased his grip on the rubble. Although it was tremendously painful to do so with his nails chipped, he still grit his teeth and did it anyway. What was a little pain when compared to his very life? If he had to make the same choice 1,000 times, then he'd choose his life every time. But again, things wouldn't go smoothly just because he wanted them to. Just as he was braving through the pain, the blood from his fingers greased the rubble, causing his hands to slip off. Lee found himself falling again, this time his expression leaning toward shock. How was this possible? After all he'd been through, was he really going to die because of such a foolish reason? Surely this had to be a joke, right? Unfortunately, it wasn't a joke, and his old ass was definitely falling. Luckily, however, the subsequent run-ins with the beam and boulder had changed his trajectory enough to let him crash on another platform. Lee felt the impact of the fall and stared wide in shock. He'd already counted himself as a dead man, so this was undoubtedly a pleasant surprise. He quickly ignored his pain and breathed out in relief. He'd made it. He'd miraculously made it. Seems like his luck wasn't so shitty after all. Learning from his past mistake, Lee promptly crawled off the platform. He was aware he'd already used up all his accumulated luck, so he dared not linger on the platform a second longer. Who knows? Maybe the bastard might just crash a second later, and he'd have no one but himself to blame. Thus, he quickly skedaddled, rushing back into the building with the quickness. After making it back inside, Lee began his plans in earnest. He knew the staircases were a no-go, so he had to figure out a different route to escape. He ruled out a bunch of options before settling on the main corridor for now. Since there were no living humans in the building anyway, he figured it would be feasible, provided he stayed clear of the patrolling wasps. Just as he resolved to act on his plan, a stealthy stalker crept up on him, making this the second time he was caught lacking. Actually, I think it's more than 2, but there's no point in flaming our boy. Lee caught onto the stalker and immediately jumped back in surprise. He screamed like a little bitch, audible whimpers escaping his lips from time to time. The host, however, stared at him silently, giving him the same confused look the wasp had. It gazed at him fixedly before turning around and leaving on its own. Lee, seeing this, struggled to calm his beating heart, a task he found more difficult than expected. He couldn't blame himself, though, because that run-in had almost spelled his doom. But again, what in the hell was happening? Why did the wasp and their host keep pulling up on him only to ignore him seconds later? What was he missing? He promptly checked himself, only to find a suspicious larva on his wrist. At first, he was confused, but after seeing the ugly bastard, Lee couldn't help but stare at it in a panic. Surely it couldn't be what he was thinking, right? However, before he could delve deeper, a hand suddenly grabbed his shoulder, scaring the shit out of him. Lee reverted back to his bitch ways, screaming like a bitch for all to hear. He then picked up a nearby rock, intending to smash whoever was behind him. However, halfway through the swing, the stalker's identity got revealed, and Lee couldn't help but look at him in shock. Wasn't this Director Choi, the bastard? What was this fool doing here, and alive at that? Choi picked up on his shock and promptly greeted him with delight. He expressed his happiness at finding another survivor, but now wasn't the time to chat. He told Lee to follow. He'd lead him to a safer location. Lee didn't hesitate and followed Choi to his hideout. Although he had a lot of questions, they could wait until they got somewhere more secure. After crawling and slipping past a couple of wasps and their patrolling hosts, the duo finally made it to Choi's hideout. The place was essentially the old copy room, with the entrance blocked for obvious reasons. Lee, who was secretly observing the place, noticed the abundant supplies, with a shit ton of water free for the taking. He had his doubts about that, but there was one question more pressing than the rest. How the hell was Choi still alive? He didn't shy from asking this and immediately turned toward Choi for an explanation. Choi, however, brushed past the question and talked about his feelings instead. He again emphasized that he was happy to see him. Having an additional survivor was a great thing after all. Doubling down on his ass-kissing, Choi expressed how he'd believed Lee was still alive. He couldn't be sure about the rest, but he definitely knew Manager Lee. The Chad would definitely make it through somehow. Lee looked at him silently, not bothering to hide the suspicion in his eyes. If there was ever a survivor he definitely didn't expect, it was this snake, Choi. Choi, picking up on his tense gaze, brushed off another question about his survival and swiftly changed the topic. He rummaged through his supplies, offering Lee some rations to eat. During the process, he attempted to divert the conversation again, opting to talk about the wasps instead. From his understanding, he'd identified two types of attacks from the wasps. The first was the most common, where the wasps would knock out the prey using their stingers before using their unconscious bodies to nurture their larvae. The second was a direct attack while the prey was still conscious. After laying their eggs on the conscious prey, they'd immediately turn into their hosts, acting as a moving scout for them. He didn't know why, but the humans turned into hosts were beyond saving and couldn't be woken up no matter what. Lee, who'd finally lost his patience at this point, shouted at Choi to shut up. Why was he deliberately avoiding his question? He'd asked so many times, so why wasn't he answering? How the hell was he still alive? Choi, taken aback by Lee's sudden outburst, stared at him somberly. His fake smile of innocence slowly disappeared, leaving behind the scheming face we all know. This bastard. I'm pretty sure he did some vile shit to survive. Shit. An unnerving silence settled in the room after Lee's question. The duo both took a step back, staring at each other silently. Although Choi was clearly rattled by the sudden outburst, he did his best to hide that fact. In fact, it was only after composing himself for a dozen seconds that he dared to speak again. He shot Lee an accusatory look, asking what he meant by that. Was he not supposed to live? Or what was he trying to insinuate? Matter of fact, even if he wanted to answer him, how was he supposed to respond? Should he lay out every detail of his arduous struggle? Or should he give him just enough info to satisfy his supposed curiosity? Lee should speak up because he didn't know what he wanted from him. But that aside, what was up with this tense atmosphere? He'd expected Lee to be happy to see him, another survivor. But judging from his reaction, it was clear he was less than pleased. In any case, he was sincerely happy to see that Lee was alive. Lee listened to his ramblings and gulped audibly. It wasn't that he was thirsty or something. Rather, it was a reflexive response to prevent himself from saying some foul shit. He knew for a fact a coward like Choi couldn't have survived on his own. He was sure the bastard had used others as human shields in order to save himself. However, he couldn't outright say that. Since they were the only survivors he currently knew of, it was better to keep the peace than to initiate a fallout at this time. Choi, picking up on Lee's demeanor, sighed in resignation before addressing him once again. He shared bits of his survival story, highlighting that it had been 5 days since the fall. During that time, he'd been doing everything he could to survive. Lee heard the first parts of his narration and immediately told Choi to hold the fuck up. What did he mean it had been 5 days? If so, then where was the rescue team? The army? Surely the government should have responded by now, right? Choi, visibly taken aback by Lee's random interruption, asked what he was talking about. Didn't he know? Or could it be that he'd been unconscious for 5 days straight and missed all the action? Well, if he was that curious, then he'd tell him. The army did come, and it was actually them who destroyed most of the buildings. What? Did Lee actually believe the wasps would be capable of such destruction? Nah. It was definitely the army's doing. They came in guns blazing and fought the bugs for 2 days straight. However, for some reason, they suddenly packed up and left, disappearing as swiftly as they'd arrived. He didn't know why they'd done that, whether they were defeated or simply chose to retreat after saving some high-priority VIP. He had no idea, so Lee shouldn't ask him such bullshit. In fact, he was already frustrated enough that his phone had been out for 3 full days. If Lee kept pushing him like this, then he might just lose his mind. Matter of fact, since they were talking like this, Lee shouldn't think he was stupid. Did he really think he couldn't tell what he was thinking? What he was insinuating? He probably thought he'd used others as meat shields to protect himself, right? That's what he wanted to ask, right? Lee shouldn't treat him as a fool because he was all too clear about his hidden thoughts. However, he'd have him know that he'd misjudged him. He hadn't used anyone as meat shields, nor had he ever held any hostility towards him. In fact, all the rumors about him screwing him over in the company were just that. Rumors. He never stole his accomplishments, nor had he ever intended to suppress him in the workplace. It was all the high-ups' fault. They forced him to claim Lee's work and accomplishments as his own, and even forced him to suppress him too. He had nothing to do with it and was just an innocent victim, same as Lee. This bastard, does he even believe his own bullshit? Surely he doesn't expect anyone to buy this shit, right? Seems like he truly does, because he went ahead with the foolish ramblings. He told Lee they were in it together and even tried to protect and stand up for him. If Lee really thought about it, he'd know he had no reason to be against him, because after he was gone, the next one on the chopping block would be him. Done with his nonsense ramblings, Choi took a deep breath to calm himself. He begged Lee to believe him, insisting that he had no reason to lie. Lee, who'd been silent the entire time, stared at him warily, choosing to keep his thoughts hidden for now. However, even if he didn't say anything, can anyone truly trust such a punchable face? Such tame, backstabbing faces are always so easy to tell. Choi, seemingly picking up on this as well, quickly changed the topic, choosing to talk about the larva on Lee's arm instead. He promptly reached for it, clearly intent on removing it from the coat. Lee, however, noticed his actions and swiftly swatted his hand away. He told Choi not to worry about it. He'd handle it on his own. Deep down, he cautioned himself to be on guard, because this treacherous bastard was clearly up to something. Choi, although surprised by Lee's aggressive response, decided not to dwell on it. He still needed him, after all. Speaking of Lee, he realized something fishy and immediately questioned Choi about it. Why was he still here? Sure, he understood the army didn't save him, but why hadn't he escaped on his own? Surely he must have thought of that, right? Choi looked at him before sighing softly. He could tell him, but it was way better to just show him. With that, he turned to leave, instructing Lee to follow after him. After sneaking through the hostile office, Choi led Lee to a hole in the wall. He somberly pointed through the wall, asking Lee to take a look for himself. Lee, clearly puzzled by Choi's actions, decided to comply, warily casting his gaze through the hole. What he saw left him utterly dumbfounded. In the middle of the room lay a heap of bodies, all of them piled together like some cheap feed. In addition, there were wasp larvae, the contrast making for a bizarre yet ominous scene. Choi, deeming it the right time to explain, told Lee the group of captives were a special case. The wasps hadn't laid eggs on them, nor had they harmed them in any way. After they were knocked out, they were simply gathered and placed in that heap, their purpose unclear for now. However, that's not why he led Lee to this place. He then pointed towards a specific location, asking Lee to take a look. Lee did just that, and was shocked yet again. Amongst the heap was a familiar face. The very same pixel baddie from the start of the story. Choi, taking advantage of Lee's sudden shock, told him she was still alive, and that's why he hadn't escaped this place already. He'd been sticking around to save her. On his own, it was close to impossible, but with Lee there, they stood a fighting chance. However, to do so, they had to find a solution for the wasps, because the room was swarming with them. Lee, eyeing the pathetic state of the pixel baddie, cursed to himself, wondering why he was so unlucky. If he hadn't known about her, it would have been fine. But now that he did, he couldn't possibly abandon her. Besides, if he didn't help her, who would? This sketchy bastard Choi could never be trusted after all. Steeling himself, Lee decided to give it a shot. Since there was a non-zero chance of success, he had to try at least. Choi, feigning concern, asked if he was sure. There were a shit ton of wasps in there after all. Lee didn't reply and simply took off his coat. He then placed the larva on it before going to town on it. To Choi's bewilderment, Lee stomped that bitch, making sure the larva inside was properly squished. When he was done, the whole coat was a gross mess, a fact Choi didn't hesitate to mention. Lee, however, ignored his sketchy ass and went on his way. He slowly descended the stairs, making sure not to attract any hosts toward him. When he got to the corridor leading to the creepy room, he paused to steel himself before addressing Choi once again. He told the latter he'd bring the baddie back, so Choi should rendezvous with him there. Choi said cool and swiftly shooed him away. Although he didn't know how Lee would hide from the wasps, he wasn't particularly interested, because it wasn't his life on the line. Thus, he told him to go ahead. He'd be waiting for him there. Lee didn't hesitate and immediately draped the coat. He used it as a makeshift cloak, hoping to blend into the background. With bated breath, he successfully sneaked through the room, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. However, his short streak of victory soon ended when a bloated monstrosity fixed its gaze on him. It eyed Lee, causing the latter to break out in cold sweat. Lee did his best to stay calm, although that was proving difficult under the intense stare. His heart beat like crazy, and he couldn't stop himself from having thoughts of abandoning this shit and running away. Luckily, the moment soon passed and the bloated freak went on its way. It was only after that Lee finally let out the breath he'd been holding. Damn. He was somewhat sure that would work, but it didn't stop him from panicking like crazy. Ever since the incident with the wasp, he'd suspected the larva kept him hidden, kinda like a disguise or something. So long as he had it or its juices on him, the wasps and the hosts would treat him as one of their own. But even still, that didn't stop the experience from being one of the worst he'd ever experienced. If he could help it, he'd rather not go through that again. As if fate was laughing at him, a giant wasp suddenly spawned above him, scaring the shit out of him. Lee panicked instantly, fearing that his disguise had been revealed. He stayed rooted in place, not daring to move an inch. Focusing his attention on the wasp, he was shocked to find that the wasp was doing the same with him. It stared at Lee, seemingly contemplating what to do with him. After seconds of tense silence, the wasp finally left, leaving Lee soaked in a pool of sweat. He'd already known this was a shit idea, but damn, this really drove the point home. Without hesitation, he decided to turn back. He couldn't be risking his life like this. Just as he was about to book it, he caught a glimpse out of the corner of his eye that made him pause. He'd unknowingly reached the creepy room, and his target was literally in front of him. To make it worse, the baddie, the subject of the rescue, had also seen him, so he couldn't turn back now. Cursing under his breath, Lee steeled himself again and made a beeline for the baddie. The baddie, in return, flailed around, seemingly begging to be saved. Lee saw this and doubled his speed. Since things had developed to this point, he might as well go all out and save this bitch. Thus, he put on his big boy pants and swiftly crawled to the maiden. When he got to her, the baddie was still flailing, so Lee did his best to calm her down. He told her to stay still. He was there to save her. The baddie, however, didn't listen and continued with her flailing. In fact, the gesture became more frantic, causing Lee to have a bad feeling. True to his guess, the baddie finally spoke, warning him to run away. She urged him desperately, otherwise, it would be too late. Lee, who was already sweating at this point, heard the next warning and instantly felt his heart sink. He whipped his head to the side, searching for the dreadful threat he'd just learned about. Turns out, there was a bigger threat in the room, and Lee had just delivered himself to it. Worst part? It was the deadliest of the threats, as it signified the peak of the monsters, the queen. Damn, he really cooked himself this time.